For this deep dive. It's kind of like we're all in a book club right now. We're going to be talking about Vince, a piece of microfiction. It's late night, shady bar, and this character Vince, who, he's unsettling. He's interesting. He's definitely somebody you want to talk about and try to figure out. And the cool thing is we have three different reviewers who have given us their perspectives. So that just gives us even more to kind of dig into. So without further ado, let's jump right into this world of Vince and see what we think.
One of the things that strikes me right off the bat is we're kind of thrown right into this world of moral ambiguity. Right. So the story opens with the second thing you notice about Vince. I mean, right away you're like, well, what's the first thing? You're already kind of set up for a character who's full of contradictions.
Yeah, it definitely grabs your attention and it makes you want to know more. Like, what is that first thing? And then as you get to know Vince a little bit, those contradictions, they just become even more apparent. He's described as a dopehead, always late jittery. But yet there's this underlying innocence that everybody seems to notice about him. It's so interesting. What do you make of that duality in his character?
Well, it makes me think, you know how we like to put people in boxes, right? Like you're either good or bad. And the reality is it's so much more complex than that. And I think Vince really kind of defies those easy categorizations. Is his innocence genuine? Is it a facade? Can you even be a dopehead and innocent? I don't know. It's these are the things that make him a compelling character and a character that I think deserves a little exploration.
I agree. And it seems like our reviewers, they're kind of wrestling with that complexity too. Some of them see him as this almost like holy fool figure, while others see him as more of a vengeful angel type delivering some kind of twisted justice.
Yeah, and that's a good point because they're all over the place, right? Their interpretations are so diverse, and that speaks volumes about the power of the story. One reviewer even mentions Vince as this sort of archetype of the anti-hero, a character who defies traditional heroic qualities but still manages to compel us. And I think Vince definitely fits that mold.
Totally. He's not your typical hero, that's for sure. And then there's that scene in the bathroom. I mean, talk about a pivotal moment that throws everything into sharp relief.
Yeah, I mean, things really come to a head, right? And we see all this violence that's been kind of simmering beneath the surface just erupt. But even in that moment of brutality, there's this chilling calmness about Vinch. He's smoking a joint amidst all the blood and chaos, almost as if it doesn't even faze him. And that contrast, that psychological depth, it's really unsettling.
It's disturbing. Yeah, and it just makes you wonder what's going on in his mind. I mean, is that detachment a sign of something like sociopathy, or is it something else entirely? What do you think?
Well, that's a question that I think would require a little more exploration, right? Perhaps even looking into the psychology of violence itself. Maybe Vince is desensitized to violence. Maybe his actions are a twisted form of righteousness. I think the story really leaves that interpretation open to us.
Yeah, it does. And that ambiguity leads to another really fascinating character, Beaker. He's our narrator, the one telling us this story. But how reliable is he? I mean, right from the start, he's admitting his own cowardice. And then he betrays Vince when things get dangerous. So you really start to question his perspective on everything.
Yeah, Beaker's role is really interesting because he acts as this kind of moral counterpoint to Vince. So you have Vince representing this enigmatic mix of violence and innocence, and then Beaker, who embodies a more relatable human struggle with fear and self-preservation.
Right. He even says he always suspected he was chicken. I mean, does he downplay his own guilt? Is he trying to shift the focus onto Vince's actions? It makes you wonder.
It does. His internal conflict adds another layer to the story's exploration of morality. One reviewer actually pointed out a parallel between Beaker's betrayal of Vince and the biblical story of Peter denying Christ,
Hmm.
which, it really highlights that timeless struggle we have between loyalty and self-preservation. A dilemma that, probably many of us can relate to on some level.
Oh, for sure. I mean, haven't we all been in those situations where we have to choose between doing what's right and protecting ourselves? It's not always easy, and I think Beaker really embodies that human struggle. But there's one other character I want to talk about who seems to be quietly observing all of this. Seminary Mike. What are your thoughts on him?
Oh, Seminary Mike. He's an interesting presence in the story. He doesn't say much, but his actions speak volumes. He's always practicing pool, holding his cue like it's some kind of possession cross. It's like he's the silent judge watching everything unfold.
Yeah, exactly. And I keep wondering, what does his presence add to the overall moral tapestry of the story? What do you think?
Well, one reviewer interpreted him as a symbol of institutional religion, maybe even representing a path to redemption that contrasts with Vince's, more chaotic brand of justice. But, like everything else in this story, his role is open to interpretation.
That's true. And it makes you wonder why Vince directs his final words, "You're free, you are forgiven," to Mike specifically. I mean, what's the significance of that exchange?
That's a question that I think really gets at the heart of what this story is trying to say about redemption and forgiveness. Is Vince offering genuine absolution, or is there something more complex at play?
It's definitely a moment that gives you pause, and that's what I love about Vince. It doesn't give us any easy answers. It invites us to really kind of delve into those complexities and wrestle with the gray areas of morality.
It does, and that's why I think this book club discussion is so interesting. It's not just about understanding the plot, it's about exploring those deeper questions that the story provokes.
Yeah, and speaking of deeper questions, there's a lot of symbolism woven throughout this narrative. It's not just a gritty crime story. There are layers of meaning that make you really think, and I think our reviewers really picked up on that, especially when it comes to the religious themes.
Yeah, I mean, the way Vince is depicted, especially in that bathroom scene, it's almost like a twisted biblical parable.
Right, he becomes this unlikely, incredibly violent savior figure.
Yeah, and one reviewer even pointed out the connection between the removal of Rouge's ears and Old Testament punishment, symbolizing this kind of rough justice.
That's a great observation. And then there's all that blood imagery that permeates the entire story. I mean, it's not just gratuitous violence. It feels deliberate, like it's meant to represent something much more profound.
Yeah, and the reviewers had some interesting takes on that too. One described the blood as a medium of cleansing, almost like a baptism, tying into that larger theme of redemption, but in a really unconventional way.
Like redemption through transgression, which is such a thought-provoking concept. And it circles back to that ambiguity we were talking about before. Is Vince a force for good, even if his methods are brutal?
That is the question, isn't it? Can violence ever be redemptive? It forces us to really confront our own beliefs about justice and morality, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
No, definitely not. And then you've got this unseen figure looming over everything the mayor. We never actually meet him, but his presence is constantly felt. What do you make of his role in the story?
He represents that those unseen forces of power and corruption that control people's lives. He's the embodiment of the system that Vince seems to be rebelling against, even if it's in this unorthodox way.
And then there's the lingering question of who actually stole from the mayor. Was it Vince? Was it Seminary Mike? We never get a clear answer.
Nope, and that ambiguity is so well done because it reinforces that idea that nothing is black and white in this world. It makes us question our assumptions about guilt and responsibility. Is Vince taking the fall for someone else? Is he sacrificing himself for a greater cause?
It definitely adds to the mystery and the complexity. But I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the setting that dingy bar after hours. It's more than just a backdrop, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One reviewer described it as a liminal space, a place between worlds, and I think that's perfect.
Oh, I love that. It's both physically and morally in between. It's after closing time, so it's outside the normal rules of society. And the characters who inhabit this space are all operating in this gray area between right and wrong.
It's almost like a microcosm of the story's themes. The bar becomes this crucible where morality is tested, and those traditional boundaries, they just blur.
And the language of the story really adds to that atmosphere, too. Beaker's narration is so raw and gritty. It pulls you right into that world.
It's that barfly confessions style, like you're eavesdropping on a conversation you're not supposed to be privy to. But for all its grittiness, the story also has this really unique structure that keeps you guessing.
Oh, yeah. It's not linear. We're thrown right in the middle of things, and information is revealed so gradually, like pieces of a puzzle.
Yeah, and that nonlinear approach, it mirrors the ambiguity of the story itself. We're constantly trying to piece together what's happening, just like the characters are trying to make sense of Vince and his actions.
It keeps you on the edge of your seat, constantly questioning everything you think you know. And that's part of what makes Vince so compelling and memorable. What do you think the overall impact of the story is? What does it say to you? What resonates with you the most?
Well, for me, Vince is a story that really sticks with you. Even after you finish reading it, it's kind of like a shot of whiskey. It just lingers. It makes you think. It makes you maybe even a little uncomfortable. And I think it really challenges us to look at, the complexities of human nature and those gray areas of morality.
Yeah, I totally get that. It doesn't give you any easy answers or tie things up neatly at the end. It leaves you with this sense of unease, which is, I think, what makes it so powerful. And for me, it goes back to what we were saying before about redempting. but it's not that traditional kind of redemption.
Right. Redemption through violence through transgression. It's a very thought-provoking idea. Makes you think about whether the ends justify the means. And I think it speaks to our fascination with these anti-heroes, these characters who operate outside the boundaries of, our traditional ideas about morality.
Oh yeah, I think we're drawn to their complexity, their darkness, even if we don't agree with their actions. And Vince, he's the perfect example. He's repellent and yet strangely compelling at the same time. One of the reviewers used a phrase that I thought was really interesting, divine justice. Do you think that's a fair way to describe what Vince does?
It's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, it makes you think, is there some higher power at work? Is Vince some kind of instrument of fate? But it also makes you think, what is divine justice anyway? I mean, is it about retribution? Is it about punishment? Or is it something else entirely?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of what makes Vince so thought-provoking. It doesn't give us any easy answers. It just invites us to think about those ambiguities, to really examine what we believe about justice and morality.
Exactly. And maybe, those answers are different for everyone, but it gets us thinking.
And I think that's where the real power of Vince lies. It's not just entertainment. It's a catalyst for deeper reflection.
It is. It makes us look at those shadowy parts of ourselves. It makes us realize that good and evil, they're not always so easy to define. And sometimes it's the most unlikely people who really challenge our perceptions and make us look at our own moral compasses.
And as we start to wrap up our deep dive into Vince, I want to leave our listeners with this question. What if Vince was a character in your life? I mean, how would you react to him? Would you trust him? Would you be afraid of him? Or something else?
That's a great question. And I think how we answer that question says a lot about, what we value and how we see the world. And maybe in thinking about that question and really wrestling with it, we start to understand ourselves a little better. And, those complexities of human nature, it really makes you think about it, doesn't it? And that's what makes Vince so compelling. It stays with you. It makes you question things. And it's not always comfortable.
No, it's not. It's not a comfortable story. And you're right. It forces us to examine, those gray areas. And for me, I think what really stands out is that idea of redemption, but in such a messed up way.
Yeah, through violence, through breaking the rules.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder if doing bad things can ever lead to good outcomes.
And it ties back to that idea of the anti-hero. The person who does questionable things, but we're still drawn to them. Vince is like the ultimate example of that.
He really is. He's both repulsive and attractive at the same time.
Right. And I keep thinking back to that phrase one of the reviewers used, divine justice. Do you think that's an accurate way to describe what Vince does?
It's a really interesting way to look at it. It makes you think maybe there's a bigger plan at play here, like fate or something.
Yeah.
But then you have to ask yourself, what does divine justice even mean? Is it about revenge, or is it something else entirely?
Those are great questions. And again, it just shows how Vince makes us think. It doesn't give us easy answers. It makes us grapple with those really complicated ideas about justice and right and wrong.
And maybe there are no easy answers. Maybe it's different for everyone. But the story gets us thinking about those things.
And that's what good art should do, right? Make us think. And I think Vince definitely achieves that. It's not just a story. It's an experience that stays with you.
Absolutely. It's a story that makes us confront those darker parts of ourselves and realize that good and evil aren't always black and white.
Well said. And with that, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Vince. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. If you met Vince in real life, how would you react? Would you trust him? Fear him? Something else?
That's a great question to think about. And I think our answer to that says a lot about us and how we see the world. And maybe by really thinking about how we'd react to Vince, we can learn something about ourselves.
I like that. So to everyone listening out there, keep thinking about Vince. Keep discussing it. And as always, keep diving deep into those stories that make you think and feel and question everything.